Hello First Church family, welcome back to another video that we're throwing up on our YouTube page. Today we're actually going to be looking at the book of Genesis. We're going to do a bit of an overview from start to finish of the 50 chapters that are Genesis. So as many of you know, our upcoming study for this entire year is the book of Exodus. Just like last year we looked at the book of Ephesians, this year we're looking at Exodus. And Exodus is a substantial book. But it also assumes that you know the story thus far. So everything that led up to the story of Genesis. So today, we're just going to spend a couple of minutes recapping everything that went on in the book of Genesis. And that begins at the very beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we get this beautiful story in the first couple of chapters of Genesis of God creating earth. And what this tells us is that God is sovereign over all creation. Everything that is here on earth, everything that will happen and everything that has happened is all due to his handiwork. And the beauty that we see around us, the trees, the oceans, the mountains, everything, all come from the Father. And he says, after each section that it lays out, he says that everything is good. Everything that he makes is good. But then we get to this different moment in creation when he creates humanity. He creates humanity, and at this point he says that it is very good. See, humans are made in God's image. They're set apart from the rest of creation to represent God himself and to tend to the earth and to own it and to really bring it, to raise it up and to be an honoring thing for the Father. But as many of us know, this did not last very long. We get to Genesis chapter 3 when we see the story of the fall. You see, humans, Adam and Eve, were living in the Garden of Eden at this time, living with God, in communion with God at all times. And they're just asked to not do one thing. And that one thing that they're not supposed to do, they do the very human thing by doing that one thing and messing it up. And this is where we have this concept of the original sin, that moment whenever humanity is kicked out of the garden and removed from God's presence in that way. And the rest of the story of the Bible is all about God bringing us back to that communion with him. But at this point, humanity is tossed out of the garden as a consequence of their sin. We start to follow this story of the generations that follow after Adam and Eve, and we get down to a point where there's this one guy called Noah, and everyone else on the planet just seems to completely not care about who God is, what he's done up until this point. And it just seems like the world at this point is a despicable, horrible place with nothing godly left except for this one man and his family. And in Genesis chapter 6 through 8, around there, we have this story of God cleansing the whole world of his creation. Humans have just messed it up so much that God decides to start afresh. And we have the story of Noah and his ark and this flood story, where Noah begins again, has animals on this ark that can start afresh, and the world starts all over again. And God promises not to wipe it out ever again in that way. So he starts this whole story again, and we start to follow through generation after generation after generation coming after Noah until we get to this man, Abraham. Now, Abraham, as we all know, had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, and we keep going down, but see, Abraham was given this promise from God, a very specific and important covenantal promise with God that he will have descendants as numerous as the stars. You see, God promised to bring Abraham and his family into a great nation. And Abraham moved around a little bit from different areas, but he ended up in Canaan for a while, where they began to settle. And in that whole area, Abraham finally had a son called Isaac. And Isaac had a son called Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons, the youngest of whom was his favorite, a man called Joseph. And a lot of us know the story of Joseph and the Technicolor dream coat, or the multicolored coat, that his brothers were so jealous of that they sold him into slavery into Egypt. And at this point, you would think that everything is just getting all terrible again, just like it did back when Noah was around. But God has a different plan this time. And he works with Joseph. He works through Joseph to bring about a giant drought in the land that only Joseph was able to handle. And he raised Joseph up from being a slave to being second in command in all of Egypt. And even getting to a point where he was able to save his brothers who threw him into slavery to begin with. And the whole story ends at the end of Genesis in chapter 50, where Joseph, talking to his brothers, say, "What you did, you intended for harm, but God is able to use it for good. And then we go on and we get a little bit of a story about Joseph's death, which leads us into this next section of the story of Scripture, into the book of Exodus. So God's people are currently residing safely in Egypt at this point. But that is all about to change as we dive into the book of Exodus on Sunday mornings. So that is the story so far. So please come and join us on Sunday mornings at First Church here in Grayson, or join us online if you're not in the Grayson area but you're just watching our content. That's great. We do post all this stuff online. But if you're nearby and you would like to join us, please do. We would love to have you as we dive into the wonderful book of Exodus.